Welcome to the module on administering Azure resources. In this module, we will explore two main methods of configuring Azure resources, using administration tools and using ARM templates. We will start by comparing various administrative tools, including Azure Portal, Azure Cloud Shell, and Azure PowerShell and CLI. You will learn how to use Azure Portal and Azure Cloud Shell. So let's get started. Let's have a look at it on the whiteboard. Now, to access your portal or your resources in Azure, we can use Portal. For most of the time, we will be working on the portal in this course. However, within the portal, if you are looking at other methods of accessing your resources, we can do this using your Azure apps. So you do have access to your Azure resources using mobile apps. Apart from that, you can explore command line interface or CLI for you to use bash scripting, or you can also work with PowerShell. Now, if you are looking to create your SDKs for your resources, deploying them, you can use your deployment kits using some of these options. Now, if you're looking to work with your command line tools, you can also use something called Cloud Shell, which is available for you to work with on the cloud. Now, regardless of the method that you choose to log into your resources, in the backend, either you're working with CLI, Cloud Shell, or your portal view, you are going to be simply gaining access to what we refer as in the backend as your Azure Resource Manager. Let's try to redraw that line again. So bringing that down in here and connecting that to that. Let's call this as ARM, so Azure Resource Manager. Now, let's link in the Cloud Shell as part of that. The main aim for your Azure Resource Manager is to control the access of your resources that sit in the cloud. Now, before you gain access to your resources, no matter what method you use, you're going to be asked to authenticate yourself. Let's write this as auth-in or authentication. And as a result of that, you get authorization to be able to work with that resource at a certain level or with the permissions that you're given as part of your setup. Now let's have a look at some of these details in the cloud. Now, one of the first things that we are going to try to do is look at the documentation on some of these resources. Now, if we jump onto the Learn portal and start looking at Azure CLI, this documentation explains on how we can utilize the CLI scripting in accessing your resources. One of the things that it might suggest that you need to do is install a module for you to be able to run these in your environment. So you might want to follow the instructions on how to go and install some of those modules on your system. Now, once you've completed that, it would suggest on how you can go and sign into your resources, such as using different commands, syntax like AZ login. Now, let's have a quick look at this. Now, on my system, I've already installed that module. So all I'm going to do is run my command prompt and bring it on the screen. Now, as I have my command prompt, now this is not running in the cloud, this is running on my local machine at the moment. All I'm going to do is give it a command called AZ login and hit enter. Now this should try to log me into my account that we have, and let's go into my current subscription and log in. Now this in turn is logging me into my subscription. So my subscription details are on the screen. Now, once I'm logged into my subscription, it's suggesting, is this a subscription I'm selecting because I'm logging into my account? If I had more than one subscription, all I need to do was simply choose a number that is allocated as part of my subscription. In this case, it says type in a number or enter for no changes. So we can simply type in 1 and hit enter, and it chooses my subscription to log me in. Now, once I am logged in, I am now currently looking at my Azure resources using my command line interface, using my local resource on my device, which is my command prompt. Now we can try certain other operators just to kind of look at if we are actually exploring data directly from the cloud. For example, we can start typing in commands like AZ-, and ask for help. Maybe we don't know what kind of operators can we use in terms of calling out for different things. And now this should bring me with a lot of different types of options I can type in to get information from my resources that are running in the cloud. Now, there's quite a few different options available over here to look at. So it tells me, hey, you can use different parts of this command, type in AZ and look at other subgroups that you might want to explore. Typically a resource type that I'm looking for, or other options that I might want to explore in terms of managing my resources. Now, let's come down to the bottom of this and let's try bringing in some more details. So let's type in AZ group and ask it to list my groups. Now, I could say, hit enter to this, and in return, it should give me a list of all my resource groups that I have currently running in my environment. Now, for this course so far, as part of the setup that we've created, we went into creating a resource group called AZ-104 demo in our module number 2. We can see that resource available for us at this point. I can see some other details around it, created with some tags onto it. And these are the tags that we created on the resource, and it's giving me that resource available for me to look at. Now, I could use similar other commands to go into creating resources, looking at managing resources, like creating a virtual machine stopping, starting, and many other things that you could typically do in a portal environment, but you could do that in your command line interface environment, like so in your setup. So I don't need to directly access my Azure resources using a browser. I could do that in a command line interface such like this. Now, let's stop this for now for a minute and try something else. Now, let's jump into another documentation. Apart from looking at this in a command line interface, what about PowerShell? Let's jump onto the browser for PowerShell. Now, I'm just exploring another documentation on the Learn portal, which talks about getting started with Azure PowerShell. Now, again, just like the CLI environment, it might suggest that I need to install a module for this for my PowerShell commands to be running onto my environment. Or I could be managing these resources as part of my setup, so I don't necessarily need to log in to my setup in the portal. Now, once you've gone through the setup on how to install Azure PowerShell, and you can start running your commands into that. Now, if you look at the commands for your PowerShell, obviously they're slightly different to your Bash or CLI scripting. Now you can see in this case, it starts telling me to connect to my AZ account, which is Azure account, and it can start running other types of commands within that. Now, a few things to highlight straight away over here would be this. If you're looking to work with PowerShell and you're new with PowerShell, PowerShell typically runs in a format like a verb, typically followed by a noun. In this case, if you look at some of the common ones to work with, you're looking at new, get, set, or remove. Just to have a quick reference, new would be helping you create something new. Get will be retrieving information around something that you already have. Set will be setting parameters or changing settings on an existing resource. And remove will be for deleting. Now, once you have decided on which verb that you're going to start off with, it will follow by a noun, which will typically be a resource type. For example, Azure Virtual Machine, or Azure Key Vault certificates, or Azure Firewall, and many others. Now, just to look at how this is listed, this documentation explains a little bit more around how you can utilize an example of that command. There's a list of some example resources, the ones that you can use as a noun as part of your resource setup, and you can work with them in this environment. Now let's jump back into the portal for a minute and let's explore some more details, and we'll have a look at the demo for the PowerShell within that as well. Now, as I go back into my portal, let's assume I want to run some of these commands. However, I don't have access to the other command line interfaces for now, or I want to manage that while I am in the portal. I can still do this. If I look at the top of my Azure portal, I have a prompt that's just listed right at the top, right next to the Copilot icon. Now, if I hover onto this, this tells me this is Cloud Shell. Now, when you're creating your Cloud Shell environment, you're asked if you want to work within a Bash or PowerShell environment. We can switch this at any time. Let's carry on with PowerShell, as we've seen a CLI environment already running onto my device. Let's try PowerShell. Now, this is where it's suggesting if I want to allocate a storage account to it. If I have one already, I can choose one, or if I want to retain files, then this option is not suitable, because if I choose to run this now, it won't store any files. However, what we are going to do is we are going to mount a new storage account so we can retain some of the details or files that we're working on. Let's choose a subscription and let's move on. Let's hit apply. Now, at the next stage, it's asking me, do I select an existing storage account, which I am going to do because I have an existing storage account already. However, if you want, you can let the system create one for you automatically if you want, if you don't want to configure one, or you can manually go and configure one in this case. It will ask you further details on what storage account and other details like the storage stores that are within that and you want to configure the Cloud Shell onto. Now let's choose one from the existing setup. Let's go into this, my resource group that I have currently. If I go into choosing my Cloud Shell, and let's pick one of those from here and suggest I choose a storage account that's already there and assigning a cloud file share as part of the storage account. Now we'll cover storage accounts in another module at a later date. We'll discuss some of the details around what they are a bit more in that module. For now, let's choose these settings and say select. Now, once it's happy with the settings, it is going to start loading my Cloud Shell environment. And once it's ready, I will be given a prompt to start typing in my commands. Right, our prompt is ready for us to work with. Now, let's try some things. Things like, let's say, get-help. So I want to know a little bit more around what can I do with PowerShell commands in here. Now, again, just like what we did with CLI or Bash on my device earlier on, we asked it to give us some help. In this case, we are doing something similar, so we can see it suggests a little bit more into what I can do. I can get started with it. It can explain new concepts about PowerShell if I wanted to. I can get long descriptions about things and all sorts of other things. And it gives you some examples of what type of resources I might want to start typing in to ask for further help. Now, let's try some other commands to try playing around with. For example, let's go into, let's try get -az. It's already completing that for me. Now this is part of IntelliSense, which is completing the script that I might be looking to create. So let's try something different. Let's try resource groups. So you can see all I need to do is type in. Okay, apologies, missed the cursor. Come back to the cursor again and try again resource group and hit the next arrow button, and it does that for me. Now let's hit enter. Now again, it's gone into providing me with details of some of the resource groups that we had, something that we did similar in the Bash environment or in the command line environment on my device. Something similar, but this time we're working in a PowerShell environment. So again, it's giving me details around the resources that I have, talking a little bit more around my resource group that we've created. This particular one that we're working on in this course is AZ-104 demo. Again, shows me location and tells me a little bit more about the tags it's got and the subscription that it's working under. So I can start exploring my resources just like we did with CLI. Now, part of the PowerShell, again, it's not just limited to viewing things. I just try the command to get information. We can start trying to do other things with it. Things like I mentioned, you can try looking into setting changes to existing resources by doing set, or we can start doing creating new resources by simply typing in new. And if I started doing that, let's try that again and suggest new. And you can see automatically starts filling up. Are you creating a new resource group? You would typically follow that format of the syntax that it's got there already. So AZ resource group -name, and give the name within the speech quote and the location, because it's a region that we need to try create where it's going. So it will define that as part of the script. So again, similar other resources you can type in. You can start removing existing resources and you can start managing your resources based on some of the commands that we spoke about on the documentation. Now, let's stop here for a minute for exploring my Cloud Shell. Now, I did mention we can switch this to Bash. So if you prefer using Bash, at any time you can change it to Bash. You can see the portal switching and it starts giving me the prompt to start typing in the Bash commands, so I can start requesting data in here based on Bash or PowerShell as I want to work with. Now, apart from managing the Cloud Shell, like I said, for most of the time in the course, you'll see me working through the portal. So we'll get through or get familiar with the portal view a few times throughout the course. However, I also mentioned that you can download applications, particularly for your resources. And you can see it mentions that on the portal as well. Find Azure mobile apps, download them from your App Store or your Google Store if you prefer working with any of them, or depending on the operating systems that you have. And then you should be able to manage some of your resources based on that environment. Now, let's move on to some more details around scripting. Before we do, let's have a quick look at this slide. Just to reiterate some of the points that we just mentioned. So access to your resources can be made available to you using Azure Portal. Now, we will be working through the portal for the most of the time. So we'll have a look at some of the details of how you manage resources in the portal throughout the course. As mentioned, you can look at using mobile apps so you can work or manage your resources within. We also mentioned that you can look at downloading options to run script on your device. Again, this gives you an option to open command line programs and run loads of different things from different platforms that you might be working on. However, you still have options to do this from the portal view by opening Cloud Shell to run Bash or PowerShell scripts as you like to work with them in your browser environments. Bearing in mind, there are some limitations for the Cloud Shell. Typically, the Cloud Shell is only going to be active for 20 minutes. So if your tasks that you're running on your Cloud Shell environment requires longer time to either complete a script or perform a task, then in that case, it's recommended that you use directly PowerShell or a command line solution rather than running them in Cloud Shell. Now, let's move on to talking about some more details. Now, implementing Azure resources by using portal apps or looking at command line interfaces is quite useful. However, we can also deploy resources using Azure templates. One of the advantages that you get from using templates is if you are deploying resources again and again as a repetitive task, you might want to use templates. Now, templates will help you reduce any manual tasks that you're doing for creating resources, and typically help you avoid any errors that you are prone to doing as you try to do manual processes at repetition. Now, typically, this is to ensure that you stay consistent with the resources that you're creating, and you, again, can do this at speed, at scale. Now, within your environment, typically, if, like we mentioned before, if you're working in a cloud resource, you want to have a cloud-first mentality. I need a resource to work within my environment for 4 hours. I utilize this resource once a month to do some processes. After I'm done with that process, I don't need that resource again, and I'll reuse it again at the end of the next month. And I need to do this again and again every month, but only for a short period of time. Now, it doesn't make sense me creating a resource and leaving it running in the background, because it will simply end up costing me. I can create a resource and delete it. However, if I need the same resource created again, instead of recreating it manually, going through the whole portal view, I can create a template for that resource and then simply push the template out to recreate that exact same resource that I have in the first place. Now, this could be any resource that you're looking at in Azure. In fact, it could be more than one resource, an entire solution that you might have created, and you might want to create a template for it. Now, templates can be very useful to understand how they can help you create these resources. We can find some pre-built templates from Microsoft Quick Starter templates, or we can simply start creating templates on the resource that we might have created in our environment. Now, for us to understand templates in a bit more detail, let's have a look at a quick structure of the templates first. Now, for us to work with templates, first, let's explore what JSON templates look like. Now, JSON templates are typically a key value pair of resources. Now, within this, typically your document will start with the curly brackets and will close with a curly bracket to explain the start and end of this document. Now, within that, you have particular elements that form your template. You have a few elements that are listed on the screen, things like your schema, content version, parameters, variables, functions, and resources. However, not all of these are required for your template to be complete or accepted by Azure as a JSON template to create resources. The three important ones that you must have in a template for it to be accepted as a JSON template is your schema, your content version, and your resources as elements part of your template. Now, other elements may aid in help you creating your resources, or you could use these to provide some additional details. However, they're not a must to be completed for you to create a template. Now, let's have a quick look at some of this on the portal. Now, as we go back onto the portal, let's start going into one of the resources. I have some existing resources running in my environment. I'll open one of the virtual machines as a resource type. Now, this could be any resource, doesn't have to be a virtual machine. Let's assume we go into a virtual machine's blade, and while I'm looking at the menu for the virtual machine, let's go scrolling down to the bottom of the blade, and all I'm looking for is my automation tab, and under the automation tab I have an option to export a template. Now, this is an existing resource I have, and if I want to create a template of this resource because I've configured it to the way I want it to, or created a resource that I need to reuse again and again, I'm done with it for now. I'll take a template, and I have an option to download this template. Once this gets ready, it's still generating that one for me on the portal, and I can download this and retain it, and I can simply use this template to then deploy this back into the environment at any stage when I'm ready. Now, as part of the templates, I'll explore some of the elements that I mentioned earlier on the documentation. So we have the schema, and that's, again, like I said, the important part. We have the content version that's also visible here, so we can see that's also available. We have some other details like parameters. Again, like I said, these can only help you in creating a resource that you're working with and defining the details around it. And again, if I scroll down onto this, we can see quite a few other options like my variables. And the other important element that we need to have is resources. Now, without resources, obviously your template is going to be empty. This defines on what type of resource you're working with. Particularly in my scenario right now, we're looking at Microsoft Compute/virtual machine. So it's a resource type of virtual machine. Then again, provides some more details on what that is, and it completes the template for me. Now, this is an example of a JSON template for a single resource. What about, let's go back into my resource groups and have a look at exploring some other settings. Now, assume I have another resource group that I've been working in the past. Now, this resource group that I have has quite a few different resources running. I have an app service plan in there, some virtual machines, some IP addresses, quite a few different resources. Let's assume this was part of a project that I created and all the resources that I needed, I've created them in here. Now, I know for now, I'm not going to be using these resources, and I'm going to put them to rest for now, but later at some stage, maybe a month later, 2 months later, 5 days later, I might need to reuse some of them. For now, I have no use for them at all. So instead of me keeping them there and being charged for these resources, I can get rid of them. However, before I do, I can simply go into export template. Now this time I am exporting a template at a resource group level. So I am not in a single resource at the moment, but I am at the moment on a resource group level. Now in this case, I can simply go back into exporting templates and ask it to generate a template for me. And this is where it's going to generate the template for me for the entire resource group and all the resources that it has within it. It might take a few minutes because it's generating a template for a lot of different resources. So it just takes a few seconds, and there we go. Now I can see it's got loads of different parameters because it's got quite a few different resources part of it. So again, we can highlight some of the things in here. So I have my schema, I have my content version available in here, some parameters defined as we mentioned before to kind of explain what resources I've got running inside of it and their settings. So if I scroll down, you can see a lot of different things, virtual networks there, I've got virtual machines running in there, some DNS, IP address settings. Let's scroll down to the bottom where we can see the resources. And again, these settings are obviously, or parameters are part of the resources that we've got. Again, the element that we are after is resources. And in here, you can see I've got something to do with action groups, something that I've created in my setup currently. Again, scrolling down, we can see all sorts of different resources. So I've got application security group, another resource type. We have DNS zones created in here. So quite a few different resources. Everything that I had as part of my project is now part of this template. So all I can do is I can hit download template, keep a copy of this template in my environment, and again, reuse this template at any time that I want to deploy it. Now, if I'm deploying a template, I can simply click on deploy and it could take me through the processes of what I need to do. Typically, when you're deploying a template, you might need to make some modifications to it, either the name of the resources. So if I already have the existing resource that I'm working with, I might need to rename the resource type or resources that I have. So if I've called it virtual machine 1, again, creating another virtual machine 1 might not be suitable in the same resource group or same environment. So I might need to change a name for it. And any other similar settings that I might need to configure, I can go back in here and define and edit some of that. Now, once I'm happy with all of that, I can simply go hit next and create those, and it will create me all those resources all over again. Well, let's not do that for this part of the demo. But again, hopefully that gives you an idea on how to recreate some of those. Now, what I am going to do is very quickly go back into the Learn portal and show you some documentation for my JSON templates. Now let's jump into Learn and type in JSON templates and hit enter. Now, templates overview is one of the documents in my learn.microsoft.com. And let's go into it. Now this explains what ARM templates are. We just went through looking at some of the details. So if I scroll down some of the details, again, it tells me how the JSON template looks like and what I can do with it. And if I scroll further down, again, it explains some of the settings around the JSON templates that I might want to be considering and creating my JSON template in my environment. Now, again, it goes through with some explanation of different settings and how you use these templates. So it's a very, very nice document for you to look at. However, if I go into creating how to create a template and choose JSON structure from the list, now this is where it goes into a little bit more around what structure do I need for my JSON template, things that we were talking about earlier on. So particularly the structure of a template that we went through in the earlier slide, talking about some of the elements that are important. And again, it covers that detail in here. Elements that are required, things like schema. And if you look at some more details like content version is required. And if I look at details like resources is a required element. Others are not required, but if you provide them or add details within them, again, it only helps the template to understand more details around the resource that you're creating. Now, This is not the only template that we can use in Azure environments. We can, however, use a different type of template in our environment in Azure. And to explain some of that, let's have a quick conversation about something called as Azure biceps. Now, for this part of the session, let me give you a very simple but a silly analogy. Now, I'm hoping you can see my hand and my arm. So if I was to raise my arm and suggest, look at this as an arm, and if I point out at this part, this is bicep. Now, again, I'm not trying to show off my muscles, but if I was to point at biceps is a smaller part of my overall arm. As you look at some of that information, you can see that typically when we talk about arm templates, these are much more simpler to work with, or in fact, much more smaller to look at. Apologies. Let's try that again. So if I draw the lines in the right place. So these are much more smaller to look at in terms of creating a template. And the syntax for this is much more simpler to look at. Now, there is an example that's listed on the screen that shows how to create a storage account using bicep, but doesn't really justify if I was to create this in my environment to compare it with JSON. For just this part, let me show you another documentation on the Learn portal. Now, as we go into the learn.microsoft.com or aka.ms/learn, I am going to simply look at documentation for bicep. And one of the first links I have is what is bicep. If I click onto that link, it explains a little bit more about what bicep is and how it works. Some of the nice things that you can look at is some examples within this. And if I scroll further down, you can see there is a quick example over here on how to deploy a storage account, like the one that we had on the slides earlier on. Now, just to give you a quick comparison, this is a JSON format of creating a storage account. As you can see how the JSON template will look like. Now, very quickly, if I switch this around to looking at a bicep template for the same resource type, you can compare the length on both. And you can see this is much smaller and simpler for users to create. However, one thing that's important to understand, Azure in the backend will still take the bicep template and will convert the information into JSON before it can go and deploy that information. So JSON is not going away anytime soon. The JSON templates are still around. So just to kind of give you a quick comparison again, that's how my JSON template looks like. And if I was to switch this to bicep, that's how my bicep template looks like. Now, if you work with Visual Studio Code, then further down on the same documentation, it gives you a very quick example of how a Visual Studio Code can help you in creating a bicep template very, very quickly. Now, this animation will start off with talking about how you can start typing in a few words or a few characters to do storage, and it will help you complete the rest of the template, just like so if you see on the screen now. So we started str and it's created the storage account for me. Now, as soon as it's done that, you can see that it's completed a bicep template for me and it's given me some details or the structure of that. Now, this is part of the intelligence that's built into Visual Studio Code. And if you have the right extension for biceps, you can create the templates very quickly. There might be some parts that you need to complete in terms of defining what the name of that resource is going to be, what location or region you're going to be placing it on. However, it should typically be fairly quick enough for you to get to complete a bicep template. This brings us to the end of this module. Thank you for participating in this module on administering Azure resources. We have covered various methods of configuring Azure resources, including using administration tools and ARM templates. We also explored the advantages of using Azure Resource Manager and demonstrated how to create ARM templates. Remember to review the reference modules and check your knowledge questions on Microsoft Learn using aka.ms/learn to reinforce your learning. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session.